Hello, everyone. I wanted to review the Singer review questions. Number one, what is the overall point of Singer's essay? What does he want to establish? That's really maybe not as easy a question as I thought when I wrote it. I don't think there's one way of putting it, but if we take our clue from what Singer actually says in the essay, here is what he says on top of page 840. The outcome of this argument is, well, that's a pretty good clue that's probably his overall point if he's telling you what the outcome of his argument is. The outcome of this argument is that our traditional moral categories are upset. What does that mean, to upset moral categories here? He says the traditional distinction between duty and charity cannot be drawn, or at least not in the place we normally draw it. So you could say, I suppose, that the major point, the overall point of his essay, or what he wants to establish, is that things, at least that we think are acts of charity, supererogatory, there's that word down here, supererogatory, are in fact just simple duties and obligations that we have. So that something like giving to charity, which appears at first as supererogatory, that is something that is very good to do, but you could not be blamed for not doing it, in fact, turn out to be simple obligations, moral obligations that we have to others, so that not only should we do them, but if we don't do them, then we are morally wrong. That is, we fail to uphold our moral duty. One could say that in general, but that's a very large claim. This is why it's not so easy to say what his overall point is. That is, if he's making the claim that there are no such things as supererogatory acts, that would clearly be wrong, as there are certain things that we do which are above and beyond what our mere obligations are. You could say that the overall point of the essay is that many of the things that we think are supererogatory, in fact, are simple obligations. And the key, I think, is this second premise that on page 836, that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. I think the major point of the essay is if you accept that, then there's all sorts of things in your life that you have an obligation to do. And one of them is to give to charities and give to others who are in need. And that is not a supererogatory act of virtue above and beyond. That is a simple duty that you have. Number two, what are the two premises that Singer begins with? Be sure to describe both the strong and moderate versions of his second premise. So this is just the thinking about the basic principles or assumptions or premises, starting points for Singer. Here on page whatever, 836, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. That's the first assumption or first premise. The second premise appears for the first time in the next paragraph. I'm just shifting, plugging in my computer. He originally presents it in its strong form, that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought to do it. That's the strong version. And the thing that makes it strong is comparable moral importance. Below, the very bottom, he said he presents the more moderate version, weaker version, less demanding version. I could even, as far as the application of my argument to the Bengal emergency is concerned, qualify the point so as to make it, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. There are actually two differences there: the very bad and the anything morally significant. You should be able to explain how that's less demanding. That is, the first stronger version, the comparable moral significance, that is, unless we are sacrificing something of comparable moral significance. The great example given in one of my classes, if you're in that section, of dropping the baby to prevent a car accident. That would be sacrificing something of comparable moral significance, right? But if we just say anything morally significant, then that would be quite a bit less demanding, right? That would be saying that we only need to act to prevent something very bad from happening if we're not sacrificing something of any moral significance, right? Not so the one before would say, well, you can stop when you are sacrificing something of comparable moral significance. So the second one is quite a bit less demanding, and that's the more moderate version. Number 3, of the strong and moderate versions of his second premise, which does Singer indicate he thinks is more correct? Well, he clearly thinks that the stronger version is more correct, and he actually says it. Try to find it. Just give me a moment. I believe it's here on page 842. The conclusion reached earlier raises the question of just how much we all ought to be giving away. One possibility, which has already been mentioned, is that we ought to give until we reach the level of marginal utility. That would be the stronger version. That is, the level at which, by giving more, I would cause as much suffering to myself or my dependents as I would relieve by my gift. This would mean, of course, that one would reduce oneself to very near the material circumstances of a Bengali refugee. It will be recalled that earlier I put forward both a strong and a moderate version of the principle of preventing bad occurrences. The strong version, which required us to prevent bad things from happening, unless in doing so we would be sacrificing something of comparable moral significance, does seem to require reducing ourselves to the level of marginal utility. I should also say that the strong version seems to me to be the correct one. I proposed the more moderate version, that we should prevent bad occurrences unless to do so we had to sacrifice something morally significant, only in order to show that even on this surely undeniable principle, a great change in our way of life is required. I guess, I don't know what his argument is, that the strong version is the correct one. That is that you, to really fulfill your own, that principle, that you would have to actually reduce yourself to the level of marginal utility to fulfill it. I don't know why. Maybe you just think that's more intuitively obvious than the weak version, but that's the one that he does say is more correct in his opinion, I guess. And number 3, of the strong and moderate number 4, describe the relevance of proximity in Singer's argument. Well, this is a very important point because it flows directly from the child in the drowning in the shallow pond argument. This is on page 837. Right after he introduces that analogy, the uncontroversial, below that, he says, I do not think I need to say much in defense of the refusal to take proximity and distance into account. The fact that a person is physically near to us so that we have personal contact with him may make it more likely that we shall assist him But this does not show that we ought to help him rather than another who happens to be further away. So his idea is that proximity is not relevant. That is, if we have established that we could help someone, no matter who they are or where they are, without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, then we should do so. And nowhere in that is it mentioned that we have different duties to people who are farther away from us or closer to us. So there's relevance to the idea of proximity to his argument, but the relevance is that he says that it's irrelevant. Describe the importance of marginal utility in Singer's argument. No, I'm not asking for a technical definition of marginal utility. It doesn't matter. By marginal utility, all you have to sort of keep in mind is that marginal utility is the point at which something loses its value, you could say, and it's sort of like in this way approaches zero, I suppose, without ever actually getting there. So the idea of marginal utility here is that, as we were saying before, as he was talking about in the passage that I quoted before, looked at before, marginal utility would be the point at which if I gave any more, I would be putting myself below the material level of people I'm trying to help, so that my giving would be irrational. It would lose its value because it would be hurting me without any real important compensation for anyone else. So it's really the criterion by which you judge the strong version of the second premise, right? You should give until you reach that level of marginal utility. Does Singer think, number 6, does Singer think that for the affluent, meaning for people who are relatively rich, which really means us, because we live in a country that, well, what kind of country do we live in? I don't know. But for the affluent, that is people who have not only the necessities of life taken care of, but have extras, I guess that would be affluent. Does Singer think that for the affluent, giving to charity is supererogatory? Well, he's just told us, if we go back to number 1, that might be the whole point of his essay, is that it's not. Does he think it is a duty? I think he does think it's a duty, but that might involve him in Kantianism. I don't know, to actually come out and say that and put it in that language. I think he does think it is a duty. What is the difference? Well, if giving to charity is supererogatory, it's something that's very good to do, but you are not required to do to be ethical. If it's a duty, it's something that is not only good to do, but you have to do it to escape being unethical. So if it were supererogatory, doing it is good, but not doing it is not necessarily wrong. If it's a duty, then doing it is good, and not doing it is in fact wrong.